Welcome everybody to Philosophy Slam, the podcast, with me, Robert Rowland Smith, and my good friend and co-slammer, Mark Vernon. Hello, Mark.
Hi there, Robert. Good to join you again.
Yes,
as
indeed.
we go for the sort of extended version of reflections on words, pairing words in the Philosophy Slam, the podcast. And we get together for live events. We've been doing it for quite a long time. And people call out individual words and we see where the evening goes. But we thought we could get together like this as well, because it's amazing what comes out of pairing words and reflecting upon them.
Exactly. So when we do our live version, we normally begin by analysing a particular word that gets thrown out towards us. It could be sausages, we've had that, or it could be consciousness. Anyway, today we're taking two words that we have had thrown out at us. I remember the word art being given to us at the House of St. Barnabas in Soho. And I remember the word play being given to us at actually more than once, but I remember at the Century Club in Soho. So we're going to look at these two words, art and play. And of course, there's a sense in which they are connected, I think, already, because although art is taken very seriously in some contexts, particularly in the context of modern art and modernist art, it's also a bit different from work. So when I was at school, which is obviously quite a long time ago now, we did art and we went to do art classes in a way which was considered only semi-serious, really. It wasn't really considered like the rest of our schoolwork. And there was a terrible prejudice, actually, in my education. I went to a public school in London, whereby if you were good at art, it was a bit of a consolation prize. It's like, you're not very good at physics or Latin, but you can do a bit of art and they're there, and we won't take it too seriously, but at least it gives you some sort of purchase on the educational system. So work and art were different, and therefore play was a bit more connoted with art, I suppose, as though it was a halfway stop between the lessons and the break time, I suppose. So we've got play, work, art. Is work the opposite of play? Is art somehow in the middle of those two things, or elsewhere? So anyway, there's just a few thoughts to start.
Well, immediately, your thought there takes me in a direction that I hadn't anticipated, but I feel a parallel kind of prejudice against art and play, because I wonder whether art and play are particularly associated with inner life, whereas work and kind of getting on in life is associated with the external world. And, we live in a time perhaps where those achievements, those, making your mark, being someone, status and all that is much more associated with the external world rather than the inner world, which feels, I don't know, you might say subjective, as if it's not quite real or it's just yours. It's kind of personal and private, whereas the objective reality, fixed by evidence and by the sciences and so on, gets a much higher recognition in the modern world. But of course, art and play are also both associated with two things that I'm very involved with. On the one hand, is psychotherapy, and there's a lot that you can say about play in relation to psychotherapy. But also, I'm very fascinated by religion, and art, I think, must have religious origins, but that it's called art signals a shift from how it might have been used originally. So that's something of where I've gone to as well, this sort of inner life, outer life, how we value these things and how they've been differently valued across time.
It's interesting you say that, because that was one of the first places I went. I gave a talk recently to an association of art therapists, and of course art is one of the chief means in which they practice their therapy, because particularly for children who can't necessarily express themselves with the kind of language that we might be familiar with, of the language of denial, projection, and so on, or even more basic things about being able to name in language or feelings. At least children can draw things, might be able to express themselves through quote unquote art in a way they might not otherwise be able to do. So the playing at art in that case becomes quite a serious expression, as you're saying, really, of inner life. But I was also thinking, because you mentioned language there, the word art is a peculiar one, really, in all sorts of ways. It comes from the Latin ars, not pronounced ars, but ars. And ars was a translation, if I've understood correctly, of a Greek term, techne, which is technique, technical. And art probably was largely understood as a technique or a series of disciplined procedures and processes that could be applied to the representation of the natural world. So if you went to the atelier, the studio of a Renaissance artist, one of the things you'd be primarily struck by in the art was the technique, the skill. And, there are stories of apprentices to Michelangelo and so on who worked for years and years and years trying to carve the marble in exactly the right way to represent the sinews of an arm in a hero that's being depicted, for example. Or you can imagine the studio of, Caravaggio, where the precise shading of chiaroscuro, where the dark becomes light and the light becomes dark, is a matter of painstaking technical process. And yet we've arrived at a point, I think, where art has lost a bit of that, and it is more associated with play and almost a loss of discipline. It's when discipline is released, then you are artistic. And I was thinking of the work of Hannah Siegel, who is, you mentioned psychotherapy. Hannah Siegel was a fairly famous psychoanalyst who wrote about art in psychotherapy. And essentially the sort of thesis is, the freer you are, the more you play, the more the art represents a true, original, authentic, uncensored, unconscious voice in your art. And you break away from the strictures of genre and expectation that might otherwise apply. So art and play, it's sort of almost come 180 degrees there. So go from art and discipline and technical studies on the one hand to art and play and the rejection almost of those formal needs.
Yeah, the word techne is very fascinating. It's one of these words that you come across in Plato's philosophy and the discussion of, well, one way into it actually, it reminds me of the story of how Socrates discovered his wisdom, which is this story that he was getting known as someone who had insightful things to say. And his friend, Chaerephon, decided to go to the Delphic oracle to ask for the sanction of the god Apollo on his friend, and was delighted when the Pythia, in her hazy state, came back with the thought that no one is wiser than he. And so Chaerephon immediately rushes back to Athens and says, great, Socrates, Apollo has said that no one's wiser than you. But Socrates knows that if you get a message from an oracle, the first thing you should do is put it to the test, because its real meaning is not what is the self-evident meaning. And so he goes around and asks various people in Athens about their wisdom. And the techne is one form of wisdom that he inquires into. That first of all, there's poets who are kind of like the wisdom holders, the official wisdom holders of the society. They write the great plays. They move the people through the experiences of life from which wisdom can be born. It's a religious function as well. That the poet was felt to be inspired by the muse, which was a form of possession, actually precisely the opposite of how we might think of the poet now, not reaching subjectively within themselves for their inspiration, but precisely the opposite, allowing themselves to be taken over by the god and speak the words of the god. So anyway, Socrates asks the poets, and he realizes that they're great with words, but they don't necessarily understand what they're saying, so they don't really have wisdom. And then he goes to the politicians, this famous period in Athens where democracy is born. Just in parenthesis, I think ancient democracy is very different from modern democracy, but nonetheless, it's remembered, and the politicians are promising the good life. And Socrates roughly realizes that they kind of believe their own rhetoric. So they're not really very wise either. But then he gets to the crafts people, the people that make shoes, or the people that are carving the great stones on the Parthenon, on the Acropolis, that was put up in Socrates' time, and asks them about their wisdom, because clearly they have a kind of skill. And what Socrates roughly realizes there is that their capacity to make representations of things can delude them into feeling that they've mastered not just the art of masonry, but sort of reality itself. They've got a sort of commanding position on reality itself. And so their wisdom is kind of flawed as well. They're slightly deluded by their ability. And that's when he realizes his own wisdom, which is that he's aware of his ignorance, whereas the poets, the politicians, and those with the techne, the ability to create things through discipline, no doubt, they haven't realized the limits of their knowledge. But techne and art, this very interesting kind of question then of where it comes from, and this mix of discipline, like you're suggesting, but also the place of inspiration having flipped 180 degrees as well.
Because you were talking about techne as well and Plato, my mind went to Martin Heidegger, who was very concerned with this notion of techne and technology, and one of his most famous works is called The Question Concerning Technology. And he's also very interested in poets and poetry too. Now, there's a bit of a link here, I think, between art and play, but transposed a bit into Heideggerian terms, which would sort of go as follows. So Heidegger, very broadly speaking, deplores the modern world because it's become too technology focused, and something we can probably resonate with today. And techne, in that modern sense, is the opposite for him of being, and being in particular as manifested through language and poetry. So the art of poetry for Heidegger is in a way the purest art of being, capital B, that precedes techne as technical. So, I mean, there's a lot going on there, obviously, in all of that, and he complicates it, being Heidegger, even further. But it's quite an interesting idea, to me at least, that art might be, and at least for Heidegger, best expressed not necessarily through visual art, because I think most of us today, when we think about art, probably go to visual art before we go to linguistic art, I think. Whereas for Heidegger, the highest art is probably language, and the language of either philosophy or poetry. And that is free from technology or anything technical. Now, he doesn't go so far as to say it's to do with play, and I think that's, as far as I know, that's not a Heideggerian word. It's not in the Heideggerian lexicon at all. But I do think this idea of a language of being, and poetry is the language of being, which is pre-technical, I think is quite appealing in some ways.
As you're talking, I'm obviously listening to what you're saying, but I'm also listening to the bird song behind you.
Yes.
I think it's even a black cap. I'm a bit of a twitcher.
Yes.
And so, it raised for me a question as you were talking was, are the birds being artful? Are they playing when they're singing? Or should we stick to the strictly neo-Darwinian survival of the fittest interpretation, which to say, no, it's pure habit, pure instinct, no doubt about trying to find a mate or protect your territory. But I'm gonna tip towards art and play in the birdsong being more than just that. It strikes me as too dire a cosmos to think that something that's so beautiful as the black cat singing is just purely about preserving your territory or trying to find a mate. I've no doubt that's partly it, but there's a kind of higher level, if you like, in the bird song, that the bird is enjoying, finding pleasure in the song as well as it being work, for the summer season. And the way I like to think about this is that if you stick to music, But I think also it does apply to words or even paint on a canvas or a drawing on a page, because the thing that's fascinating about these arts is that they're at once completely physical, completely material. It is about putting stuff down or making vibrations on the air in the case of music, or if it's performative, of course, physically moving. But we don't just see marks on a page or hear vibrations on the air. We hear tunes and melodies, or we read words that immediately are, full of meaning and resonance. It's very hard to read a book and just see marks on the page. The words spring out. It's very hard to hear some music and just hear it as vibrations coming across the airwaves to you. So it's like, where does this level come from? Where does this meaning, this felt experience and so on come from? And I very much like the idea of C.S. Lewis here. He wrote an essay called Transposition, and he argued that what art does is, in its playfulness, it brings down, hence transposes, from a kind of higher dimension that meets the lower dimension of the physical reality, the physical world. And we human beings inhabit that in-between zone, maybe call it the level of the soul. And very much part of our task in life, which is why it's fulfilling, is to artfully play in that in-between zone, connecting the purely material, you might say, with the purely spiritual, making it manifest, making it incarnate. And Lewis himself doesn't go in this direction, but I think this must be an evolved capacity that we have. But it's evolved not in the sense of just a kind of random mutation that leads to survival advantages, as in the reductive version of the bird song, but it's something that we share with other creatures who similarly, perhaps not so self-consciously, occupy this in-between zone. And so both the practical business of maintaining a territory and finding a mate, can meet the higher sense of beauty that you hear in the Black Cap song. And, this sort of intriguing feeling that music in the natural world is at once sort of familiar and strange. It's relatable, and great composers, Olivier Messiaen comes to hand, would take down birdsong and try and weave it into their compositions and see where that went. But yeah, this mix of the material and the spiritual, this mix of the purely instinctive, but the somehow inspired at the same time. I love that bringing up that sort of third possibility, and art and play seem to do that.
That's a beautiful idea, the transposition one, the C.S. Lewis. I didn't know about that. I shall have a look. But it's interesting you mentioned the bird song, and yes, I'm aware of it here. As you know, I moved to North Oxfordshire about a year ago. I used to be pretty much a neighbour of yours, Mark. I lived around the corner from you in Peckham, and then Greenwich, so South London, where I was brought up. So I'm very familiar with the kind of urban environment. And as you were talking about the birdsong there, I wondered whether art and play have been more connoted with rural settings than urban settings. But of course, no sooner did I think that, and I thought, oh yes, but modern art is almost entirely a kind of urban thing. And you think of art galleries these days, they're often forbidding white boxes, to use the kind of Clement Greenberg phrase, the white inside the white cube, I think he called it. That's right. And then we had the J. Joplin galleries, the White Cube galleries, which were created in reference to Clement Greenberg, the art historian's work, with the polished concrete floor and the rather obscure, challenging artworks on the wall or beneath you or above you or around you or wherever they might be. So we have, I think, two very different notions of art when we pass that word through this mesh of urban or rural, because I think we have a strong sense now of modern art as an urban art form and galleries being in an urban space, and modernist art being about often about buildings. Le Corbusier comes to mind. And a kind of pre-modern, pre-urban notion of art as being about flowers and nature and beauty and rivers and the natural environment and birds and birdsong and so on. But the complicating factor in that, I mentioned Le Corbusier, is that actually what's so striking to me about modern art, as in modernist art, is the degree to which it actually embraces nature. And those Le Corbusier buildings or Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, though square and modern and rationalist in their design, are often set in beautiful, tranquil parts of the world, where light is maximized to allow more nature in. The windows are huge and so on. So that distinction between art as urban and art as rural, I think it gets quite complicated. And I think it reintroduces the notion of play again, a kind of play of light, but a play of nature within those spaces.
I feel that it's a kind of like it's an intergenerational play, that kind of architecture, because it's an experiment with a philosophy behind it. But it's almost seeing, does this kind of architecture, well, what does it do? Does it connect us with the external world in which it's set through the use of glass and sight lines? Or does it make us feel a bit like we're in a box, disconnected from the world around us? And to be frank, I lean towards the latter. I feel that when a building can give you something, not just be a space in which to live, because it has its own sense of vitality and playfulness in that way. And so maybe that means incorporating natural forms into the building. I think of, my great hero, William Blake, who loved the Gothic, loved Westminster Abbey, for example, in London, but loathed Georgian rationalism, loathed those, say, Georgian churches, which are really obviously, well, to my mind anyway, clearly about mostly managing people. And there is very little sense of verticality, very little sense of natural form in them, unlike the arches and the use of ivy and flower and stars and so on in a Gothic building.
I mean, I feel we're on the cusp of a whole new discussion here, but I think probably we'll bring it to a close there, Mark. So we've been talking about art and play. We've ranged in all sorts of directions, from Heidegger to Plato and so on and so forth, architecture. Thank you all for listening to us. This was Philosophy Slam, the podcast, with Robert Rowland Smith and Mark Vernon. Do please be a good internet citizen, like, subscribe, sign up, donate, whatever you do, share things, make them go viral. And we will see you again soon. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you, Robert. And do watch out for our live performances as well at our website, because Philosophy the Slam, the podcast, has its sister activity as well. Thanks very much, Robert.
Thank you.